In the marble corridors of the Palazzo Vecchio, where Niccolo Machiavelli once walked and contemplated the nature of power, a fundamental truth echoes through time. Those who possess true strength never feel compelled to justify their actions to the world. This principle, woven into the fabric of human dominance since the dawn of civilization, reveals itself not in grand proclamations or lengthy defenses, but in the calculated silence of those who understand power's most essential characteristic. It requires no explanation. The weak explain because they seek validation. They justify because they doubt. They defend because they fear judgment. But the strong operate from a different paradigm entirely, one where actions speak with such clarity that words become not just unnecessary, but counterproductive. This is not mere arrogance or dismissive behavior. It is the strategic deployment of one of power's most potent weapons, the ability to remain impenetrable while others exhaust themselves in endless justification. Consider the boardroom where a CEO announces a controversial decision. The weak leader will spend the next hour outlining every reason, every piece of data, every consultation that led to this moment. They will address every potential objection before it's even raised, desperately trying to build a fortress of logic around their choice. But observe the truly powerful leader in the same scenario. They state their decision with quiet certainty, then sit back in measured silence. Their very stillness commands more respect than 1,000 arguments ever could. This silence is not empty space. It is dense with meaning. It communicates several crucial messages simultaneously: confidence in the decision, indifference to approval, and most importantly, the understanding that power itself is the justification. When someone possesses genuine authority, whether through position, competence, or force of character, they recognize that explaining diminishes that authority by implying it needs external validation to exist. The psychology behind this phenomenon runs deeper than mere strategy. Those who constantly explain their actions reveal a fundamental insecurity about their right to make those actions in the first place. They unconsciously communicate that their power is borrowed, temporary, or illegitimate. True power, however, is self-evident. It exists because it exists, not because it can be rationalized into existence through clever arguments or emotional appeals. In the ancient courts of Rome, emperors understood this principle intuitively. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he didn't convene the Senate to explain why this breach of law was necessary. He didn't publish treatises justifying his actions or seek popular approval through eloquent speeches. He acted, and the world understood the meaning of that action without need for interpretation. The silence that followed his march was pregnant with more meaning than any words could have conveyed. This pattern repeats throughout history in every domain where power operates. Military commanders who question their orders aloud undermine their authority with their own troops. Parents who constantly justify their rules to their children find those rules repeatedly challenged. Business leaders who explain every strategic decision discover that their explanations invite more questions, more challenges, and more doubt about their competence. The silence of power serves multiple strategic functions. First, it forces others to fill the void with their own interpretations, often attributing more wisdom and foresight to the silent authority than actually exists. When someone refuses to explain their reasoning, others assume that reasoning must be profound, complex, or beyond their understanding. This assumption works in favor of the silent party, elevating their perceived intelligence and strategic thinking without any effort on their part. Second, silence prevents the dilution of power that comes with overcommunication. Every word spoken in justification creates new attack vectors for opponents. Every reason given provides ammunition for those who wish to challenge the decision. By remaining silent, the powerful force their critics to argue against shadows, to attack positions that may or may not represent the true reasoning behind the action. Third, and perhaps most crucially, silence preserves the mystery that is essential to maintaining authority. Power that can be fully explained loses much of its mystique. When people understand exactly how and why someone makes decisions, they begin to believe they could make those decisions themselves. Mystery maintains the psychological distance that authority requires to function effectively. The modern world, with its emphasis on transparency and accountability, has somewhat obscured this ancient wisdom, but it hasn't eliminated its effectiveness. In fact, in our age of information overload and constant communication, strategic silence has become even more powerful by virtue of its rarity. In a world where everyone feels compelled to share their thoughts on every subject, the person who speaks only when necessary commands attention through scarcity alone. Professional environments provide countless examples of this principle in action. The consultant who arrives, observes quietly, makes recommendations without extensive justification, and leaves, commands far more respect and higher fees than the one who feels compelled to walk clients through every aspect of their thinking process. The mysterious confidence of the former suggests deep expertise, while the verbose explanations of the latter often reveal insecurity and amateur thinking. This extends beyond professional relationships into personal ones as well. The most attractive individuals, regardless of gender, tend to be those who don't feel compelled to explain their choices, justify their preferences, or seek constant validation for their decisions. They operate from a place of quiet self-assurance that draws others to them precisely because it suggests they possess something valuable enough to remain confident without external support. Yet this principle requires careful calibration. The silence of power is not the silence of ignorance, stubbornness, or inability to communicate. It is the deliberate choice of someone who could explain but chooses not to because they understand that explanation would weaken rather than strengthen their position. This distinction is crucial. The powerful remain silent from a position of strength, not weakness. The weak who attempt to mimic this behavior without understanding its foundations typically fail because their silence feels different. It lacks the underlying confidence and competence that makes the silence of the truly powerful so compelling. Instead of projecting strength, it projects confusion, inability, or arrogance without substance. The difference is subtle but unmistakable to those who interact with both types. Understanding this principle requires recognizing that power and logic operate in different spheres. Logic seeks to convince through reason, but power simply is. The attempt to logically justify power often weakens it by suggesting it exists only as long as the logic holds. True power transcends logical justification because it operates on a different plane entirely, one where results matter more than reasons, where effectiveness trumps explanation. The implications of this understanding extend far beyond individual interactions. Organizations that constantly explain and justify their decisions to stakeholders often find themselves weakened in the process. They train those stakeholders to expect justification, to question authority, and to view power as something that requires permission rather than something that simply exists and acts. Conversely, organizations that act decisively and communicate their decisions without extensive justification tend to command more respect from stakeholders, even when those stakeholders disagree with specific choices. The confidence implied by this approach suggests competence and forward thinking that lengthy explanations often fail to communicate. This is not to advocate for authoritarianism or dismissive behavior toward others. Rather, it is to recognize that true leadership sometimes requires the courage to act without consensus, to make decisions without unanimous approval, and to move forward without explaining every step of the journey to every interested party. The strong understand when explanation serves a purpose and when it merely weakens their position. As we delve deeper into this exploration of Machiavellian wisdom, we must examine how this principle of strategic silence connects to the broader concept of personal transformation. Specifically, how one destroys their weak self to become indestructible to others. The man or woman who has eliminated their need for external validation, who has conquered their compulsion to explain and justify, has indeed destroyed a fundamental weakness that others could exploit. The journey from explanation to silence, from justification to quiet confidence, represents more than a change in communication style. It represents a fundamental shift in how one relates to power, to others, and to oneself. It is the difference between borrowing authority from external sources and generating it from within. This internal transformation, this destruction of the weak self that seeks approval and validation, creates something far more formidable than any external opposition could destroy. Part 2. The transformation of inner weakness. The path from weakness to unshakable strength begins with a brutal confrontation, not with external enemies or adverse circumstances, but with the most dangerous adversary of all, the weak version of oneself that craves approval, fears judgment, and seeks constant validation from the world. This internal enemy is more destructive than any external force because it operates from within, undermining every decision, questioning every bold move, and whispering doubts precisely when courage is most needed. In the private chambers of his study in Florence, Machiavelli understood that political power was ultimately rooted in personal power, and personal power could only emerge from the complete annihilation of one's internal weaknesses. He observed rulers who possessed every external advantage, armies, wealth, noble birth, popular support, yet fell because they remained prisoners to their inner weaknesses. Conversely, he witnessed individuals who rose from obscurity to command empires because they had first conquered the territory of their own character. This internal war is not metaphorical. It is as real and consequential as any external battle. The weak self is a distinct entity within the psyche, complete with its own agenda, its own voice, and its own strategies for survival. It speaks in the language of doubt. What will they think? Maybe I should explain my reasoning. I need to justify this decision. I should seek approval before acting. This voice masquerades as prudence or consideration for others, but its true nature is far more insidious. It is the voice of a part of oneself that would rather remain small and acceptable than risk the vulnerability that comes with true power. The process of destroying this weak self requires first recognizing its influence. Most people go through life unconsciously obeying this internal voice, never realizing they are being governed by their own fear of standing alone. They make decisions based not on what they believe is right or effective, but on what they imagine others will find acceptable. They moderate their opinions to avoid conflict, soften their positions to maintain popularity, and constantly adjust their behavior to match perceived expectations. This unconscious submission to the weak self creates a life of quiet desperation disguised as social harmony. Such individuals may appear successful on the surface. They often are well-liked, socially accepted, and professionally competent, but they remain fundamentally vulnerable because their sense of self depends entirely on external approval. Remove that approval, challenge their decisions, or place them in situations where they must act independently, and their foundation crumbles. The strong person recognizes this pattern not just in others, but most importantly within themselves. They identify moments when they hesitate, not because the action is wrong, but because it might be unpopular. They notice when they feel compelled to over-explain decisions that they know are correct. They observe their own tendency to seek permission for actions they have every right to take. This self-awareness is the first weapon in the war against inner weakness. But awareness alone is insufficient. The weak self is remarkably resilient and adaptive. It will acknowledge criticism and promise to change while continuing to operate exactly as before. It will accept the logic of strength while continuing to choose the path of least resistance. Destroying it requires more than intellectual understanding. It demands deliberate action that directly contradicts its influence. The transformation begins with small acts of defiance against this internal voice. When it whispers that you should explain your decision to someone who has no right to an explanation, you remain silent. When it suggests you should soften your position to avoid conflict, you state your view more clearly. When it urges you to seek approval for an action you have every right to take, you act without asking permission. Each of these small rebellions weakens the weak self while strengthening the emerging strong one. This process is uncomfortable because the weak self will not surrender without a fight. It will generate anxiety about standing alone, fear about potential consequences, and elaborate scenarios about what might go wrong if you stop seeking approval. This discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong with the process. It is evidence that the process is working. The weak self only fights desperately when it senses real threat to its dominance. As this internal battle progresses, something remarkable occurs. The individual begins to discover reserves of strength they never knew they possessed. Decisions that once seemed impossible become manageable. Situations that previously generated anxiety become opportunities for growth. The need for external validation, which once felt as essential as breathing, gradually diminishes until it disappears entirely. This transformation is not about becoming callous or indifferent to others. Rather, it is about shifting the source of one's strength from external validation to internal conviction. The person who has completed this process still cares about others, still considers their needs and perspectives, still seeks to build positive relationships. But these considerations now flow from a position of strength rather than weakness. They choose to care because they decide to care, not because they need others' approval to feel worthy. The practical implications of this shift are profound. In professional settings, such individuals command respect, not through manipulation or intimidation, but through the quiet confidence that comes from self-possession. They make decisions based on their assessment of what is right and effective, then stand behind those decisions regardless of popular opinion. This consistency and independence of thought naturally elevates them above colleagues who constantly shift positions based on social pressure. In personal relationships, they become more attractive and respected because they bring something valuable to every interaction, genuine strength. Others recognize, often unconsciously, that this person operates from their own center, rather than constantly seeking validation. This creates a magnetic quality that draws people toward them while simultaneously establishing boundaries that prevent exploitation. Perhaps most importantly, they become truly indestructible in the deepest sense. While they may face external challenges, criticism, or even failure, their core remains untouchable because it no longer depends on external circumstances for validation. They have destroyed the internal weakness that others could exploit, the need for approval that could be weaponized against them, the doubt that could be used to manipulate their decisions. This indestructibility is not the brittle hardness of someone who has simply closed themselves off from the world. It is the flexible strength of someone who has found their center and can engage with the world from that position of security. They can admit mistakes without losing confidence, accept criticism without being destroyed, and face opposition without being moved from their fundamental position. The process of achieving this transformation involves several distinct phases. Initially, there is the recognition phase, where one becomes aware of the weak self's influence. This is often triggered by a moment of realization, perhaps recognizing that most of one's decisions are made based on fear rather than wisdom, or noticing the exhaustion that comes from constantly seeking approval from others. The second phase involves active resistance, where one begins to deliberately act against the weak self's influence. This is the most difficult phase because it requires acting in opposition to deeply ingrained patterns while dealing with the anxiety and discomfort such actions generate. Many people fail during this phase because the temporary discomfort feels worse than the chronic weakness they're trying to overcome. The third phase is consolidation, where new patterns of behavior begin to feel natural. The strong self starts to establish its own momentum, and acting from strength requires less conscious effort. Decisions begin to flow from internal conviction rather than external pressure, and the individual starts to experience the freedom that comes with self-possession. The final phase is integration, where the strong self becomes the dominant force in the personality. The old patterns of weakness may still surface occasionally, but they no longer control behavior. The individual has become genuinely independent in the deepest sense, not isolated from others, but no longer dependent on others for their sense of self-worth and direction. This process cannot be rushed or faked. The weak self is too sophisticated to be fooled by superficial changes in behavior. It recognizes when someone is merely playing its strength while remaining fundamentally dependent on external validation. True transformation requires genuine commitment to the uncomfortable process of growth and the willingness to stand alone when necessary. The rewards of this transformation extend far beyond personal satisfaction. The individual who has destroyed their weak self becomes a force of nature in whatever domain they choose to operate. They bring clarity to confused situations, stability to chaotic environments, and direction to organizations that lack leadership. Their strength is not diminished by sharing it. Rather, it tends to inspire strength in others who recognize the genuine article when they encounter it. As we progress to the final part of this exploration, we will examine how this internal transformation translates into external indestructibility, how the man or woman who has conquered their inner weakness becomes immune to the attacks and manipulations that destroy those who remain internally divided. Part 3. The Fortress of Self-Mastery. The ultimate expression of Machiavellian wisdom lies not in the manipulation of others, but in the achievement of perfect self-mastery, a state where external forces become powerless to disturb one's inner equilibrium or divert one from their chosen path. When an individual has successfully destroyed their weak self and established the strong self as the sovereign ruler of their inner kingdom, they have constructed something far more valuable than any external fortress. They have become indestructible from within, which renders them indestructible from without. This indestructibility is not the brittle invulnerability of denial or emotional numbness. Rather, it is the flexible strength of a tree that bends with the storm but never breaks, whose roots run so deep that no external wind can uproot it. The person who has achieved this state has eliminated the internal contradictions and weaknesses that others typically exploit, creating a unified force that external opponents find impossible to divide or conquer. In the grand theaters of power throughout history, we observe this principle repeatedly. Those who fall to external pressure invariably possess internal divisions that their enemies identify and exploit. The ruler who secretly doubts his legitimacy can be undermined by questions about his right to rule. The leader who craves popular approval can be manipulated by threats to withdraw that approval. The person who defines themselves through others' opinions can be controlled by managing those opinions. But consider the figure who has eliminated these internal vulnerabilities, When someone attempts to undermine their confidence, there is no inner voice of doubt to amplify the attack. When others withdraw approval, there is no desperate need for validation to create panic. When enemies spread criticism or lies, there is no fragile ego to wound. Such a person has become like a smooth stone that offers no purchase for external forces trying to grasp and move it. The creation of this internal fortress begins with the recognition that most human suffering comes not from external circumstances, but from the conflict between external circumstances and internal expectations or dependencies. The person who needs others to behave in specific ways to feel secure will always be vulnerable to those who refuse to cooperate. The individual who requires constant validation will always be at the mercy of those who withhold it. The one who cannot bear criticism will always be controlled by those willing to criticize. True strength emerges when one eliminates these dependencies entirely. This does not mean becoming indifferent to others or isolated from human connection. Rather, it means shifting from a position of need to a position of choice in all relationships and interactions. The strong person may value others' opinions, but they do not need those opinions to function. They may appreciate approval, but they do not require it to maintain self-worth. They may prefer harmony to conflict, but they will accept conflict rather than compromise their fundamental principles. This shift from need to choice transforms every aspect of how one moves through the world. In negotiations, the person who needs nothing from the other party holds all the real power, regardless of formal positions or apparent leverage. In relationships, the individual who offers companionship from a place of abundance rather than neediness becomes infinitely more attractive and respected. In professional settings, those who act from inner conviction rather than external pressure naturally rise to leadership positions because others recognize their stability and independence. The process of achieving this state requires systematic elimination of internal contradictions. Most people carry within themselves multiple competing voices, desires, and loyalties that create internal conflict and external vulnerability. They want to be liked but also respected, to be safe but also adventurous, to belong but also be independent. These contradictions create internal tension and provide others with leverage to manipulate behavior. The strong person resolves these contradictions by establishing clear hierarchies of values and sticking to them regardless of external pressure. They decide what matters most to them and subordinate everything else to those primary values. This creates internal harmony because there is no question about what to do when different desires conflict. The higher value always wins. This clarity of purpose serves as an impenetrable shield against manipulation. Others cannot divide someone who is not already divided against themselves. They cannot create doubt in someone who has resolved their fundamental uncertainties. They cannot generate guilt in someone who lives according to their own clearly defined moral code rather than constantly shifting social expectations. The practical applications of this principle extend into every domain of human activity. In business, the leader who has achieved internal unity can make difficult decisions quickly and stick to them despite criticism, because they are not internally torn between conflicting desires for profit, popularity, and principle. Their clarity of purpose enables rapid, decisive action, while others are paralyzed by internal contradictions. In politics, the figure who has eliminated internal weakness becomes extremely difficult to attack, because there are no hidden doubts or secret shame to expose. Their positions flow from genuine conviction rather than political calculation, making them appear authentic in an environment where authenticity is rare and therefore powerful. In personal relationships, such individuals command respect and inspire trust because others recognize they are dealing with someone who knows themselves completely and will not suddenly shift positions based on mood, pressure, or opportunity. This consistency creates security for others and natural leadership opportunities. The development of this internal strength also creates what might be called reality distortion field, the ability to influence others through the sheer force of one's conviction and clarity. When someone speaks and acts from a place of complete internal alignment, they project an energy that others find compelling even when they disagree with the specific positions being taken. This phenomenon occurs because most people are accustomed to interacting with internally conflicted individuals whose words and actions contain subtle contradictions. When they encounter someone who has achieved internal unity, the experience is striking and memorable. Such persons seem to operate by different rules, to possess access to some source of strength that others lack. The irony is that this strength is available to anyone willing to undertake the difficult work of internal unification. It requires no special talents, no unique circumstances, no external advantages. It demands only the courage to face oneself honestly, identify internal contradictions and weaknesses, and systematically eliminate them through conscious choice and consistent action. The process is not comfortable because it requires giving up many things that feel good in the short term: the warmth of universal approval, the safety of avoiding difficult decisions, the pleasure of blaming external circumstances for internal problems. But the rewards far exceed the temporary discomfort of transformation. The person who achieves this state discovers that external challenges, which once seemed overwhelming, become manageable or even welcome opportunities for growth. Criticism becomes information rather than attack. Opposition becomes confirmation that one is moving in a direction that matters. Failure becomes education rather than identity-threatening catastrophe. Most importantly, such individuals become generative forces in whatever communities they join. Their strength inspires strength in others. Their clarity helps others find their own direction. Their refusal to be moved by every shift in popular opinion provides stability that others can rely upon during uncertain times. This generative quality creates a positive cycle where strength builds upon itself. As one becomes internally stronger, they attract others who value strength and clarity. These relationships further reinforce internal development while providing opportunities to exercise and refine one's growing capabilities. Eventually, the strong person finds themselves surrounded by others who share similar commitments to growth and excellence, creating an environment that supports continued development rather than pulling them back toward weakness. The ultimate achievement of this process is the realization that true security comes not from controlling external circumstances, but from developing the internal capacity to handle whatever external circumstances may arise. This shift in perspective eliminates most forms of anxiety and fear, because one no longer feels dependent on specific outcomes to maintain well-being. When external circumstances become merely the raw material for internal growth rather than the determinant of happiness or success, one has achieved a form of freedom that no external force can touch. This is the freedom that comes not from having unlimited options, but from having unlimited internal resources to deal with whatever options life presents. The man or woman who has destroyed their weak self and built this fortress of internal strength has indeed become indestructible in the most meaningful sense. They may face external challenges, but they cannot be internally shaken. They may encounter opposition, but they cannot be divided against themselves. They may experience temporary setbacks, but their fundamental trajectory remains unaltered because it flows from internal conviction rather than external circumstances. This is the deepest teaching of Machiavellian wisdom, that true power lies not in the ability to control others, but in the achievement of complete self-possession. When one has conquered the territory of their own character, established clear governance over their own thoughts and actions, and eliminated the internal divisions that create vulnerability, they have built something more valuable than any external empire. They have built themselves into someone who cannot be conquered by any force that operates from the outside in. The silence of such individuals carries the weight of this internal achievement. They do not explain, because they do not need to justify their existence to others. They do not defend because there is nothing vulnerable within them to defend. They do not argue because they are not trying to convince others of anything. They are simply being who they have chosen to become, and that being is sufficient unto itself. In the end, this is what it means to be truly strong, not to overpower others, but to be so internally complete that others cannot diminish, manipulate, or destroy what one has built within oneself. This internal completeness naturally expresses itself as external effectiveness, not through force or manipulation, but through the simple power of being genuinely, unshakably oneself in a world full of people who are still trying to figure out who they are supposed to be. The journey from weakness to this kind of strength is available to anyone willing to undertake it. It requires no special circumstances, no unique advantages, no external permission. It demands only the decision to begin the work of internal transformation and the persistence to continue that work until it is complete. To those who complete this journey, the rewards extend far beyond personal satisfaction. They become forces for positive change in whatever domain they choose to operate, living examples of what human beings can achieve when they fully realize their potential for internal strength and external effectiveness. This document represents an exploration of timeless principles of personal power and self-mastery. The wisdom contained herein has been tested across centuries and cultures, proving its validity not through theoretical argument, but through practical application by those who have chosen strength over weakness, clarity over confusion, and internal sovereignty over external dependence. The choice to embark upon this path of transformation remains, as it always has, entirely within the hands of the individual who recognizes the value of becoming indestructible through the destruction of their own internal weaknesses.